Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Blunt Recap. And we are talking about the month of April because, like it or not, the month of April 2026 wasn't just another news cycle. It was actually a month that really exposed something deeper. They exposed how power, how influence, and actually perception actually works in this modern day society. In fact, the modern day world. We're talking 2026, we're talking the 2020s. Because on the surface, these stories actually look unrelated. But the truth is, and yes, I do admit, there are different countries involved in these stories, and there are different people involved in these stories, and even different headlines. But when you step back, you actually do begin to see a pattern that once you unsee, you just cannot actually unsee it again. And we start with the SPLC allegation and hidden incentives. Yes, the FBI they really came out with a banger on this one. Honestly, it was unbelievable because here we are having to really start with something from that didn't actually for me didn't actually get much mainstream media attention, and I really felt it should have. Honestly, it should have, because here we are with a major civil rights organization, known for tracking extremist groups and all. Now they're actually facing allegations tied to how they actually use their funds. Now, to be clear here, these are allegations. They're not proven facts. They're just allegations that have been made against them by the FBI. The case is ongoing, and the organization actually, as we speak, denies wrongdoing. But here's the thing that really, really gets me interesting. That really gets me interested. In fact, I find it really interesting and all. You see, some people are actually framing this as just mere infiltration of these groups. They say it. Some people are saying it's just intelligence gathering, but and the idea of that you monitor certain groups, by getting close to them, kind of makes sense. But hey, ladies and gentlemen, that's just one explanation. There's another question that people are actually, I feel people are actually asking enough, and that is, what happens when an organization's relevance, an organization's funding, and influence are actually tied to to the existence of a problem? Because if your entire structure depends on identifying and fighting this so-called hate, then what happens when the hate disappears? Because then the disappearance actually becomes a threat to the existence or relevance of your organization. And when that happens, you might find yourself being forced to either pivot or do some things that, well, not so many people will actually agree with. So the real question becomes, are you just observing the problem? Or is there an incentive to keep that problem alive in order to keep your relevance going? I'm not saying, look, I'm not saying that's what's going on. Look, the investigation is ongoing. I'm not going to start trying to, steer your thoughts in that sort of direction. But hey, we do need to ask that question. Because if these allegations are actually true, then it forces us to actually think about how incentives actually shape behavior, even in organizations that claim to be doing, so-called good. And if incentives, when you come think about it, if incentives can actually shape behavior like that, then we have to actually ask an even bigger question. Can we actually trust systems? Can we actually trust systems that are supposed to be transparent? And that brings me to the case of our very own, very dear U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar and her asset correction. Because something happened this month in April that I just thought, wow. I mean, we're talking about a correction in financial disclosure by U.S. Rep Ilhan Omar. I think she's from Somali, but represents a certain district in Minnesota or whatever state. The correction occurred from millions down to a much smaller figure. I think it was from about 30 million down to less than $100,000. That is, now again, this was officially corrected. That's important, because when we heard the 30 million, we were like, whoa, okay. But then the correction now occurred. And for me, it's more than just a zero that was misplaced or a misplaced decimal. But let's not just look at the correction. Let's actually look at what for us what this correction actually represents, because these disclosure systems are supposed to actually give the public clarity. They're actually supposed to answer a simple question: what do our leaders actually have? What do they actually have in the bank, and what do they have in assets? But when the numbers can actually shift or get changed so this dramatically, it actually raises the question. The question of how reliable is the system itself? Because here's the ring, here's the thing about it: transparency isn't actually about correcting mistakes. No, it's not just about correcting mistakes. It's actually about representing, or rather, preventing confusion in the first place. And when people, start to feel like, they're not getting the full picture, then, hey, guess what? Trust begins to erode. It begins to crack. It begins to shatter. And this doesn't happen, overnight, but actually it happens slowly. And once that trust is gone, whether you like it or not, it becomes very, very hard to rebuild. So now we have two things. One hand, we have the SPLC. You have an organization that is meant to be, identifying hate and hopefully even fighting it. That is sort of being caught with their pants down. Then you have a representative, who that seems to be having some very weird accounting issues, and these things actually happen at the same time. Incentives that may shape behavior, and then systems that don't always feel transparent as they should be, which actually leads to the next question: what happens when people actually start pushing back? When they start pushing back against the system, when they start pushing back against people or people or groups that they actually trust. And that brings me to the very, very interesting event that happened in Hungary between Peter Mayer and Viktor Orbán, the now former Prime Minister of Hungary, because this month we saw something interesting happen in Europe. In fact, in the country, good country of Hungary in Europe, Peter Mayer, relatively new political force, managed to actually shake up the establishment and the order led by Viktor Orbán. Viktor Orbán, a person that has pretty much ruled Hungary for about 16 years. That is quite the foundation to shake up. And regardless where you stand politically, for me, I feel that really, really matters. And I feel it should actually matter to you, because it actually shows something a lot of people have actually forgotten. And that's the fact that power isn't permanent. Yes, it looks stable. Yes, it does look untouchable. Until suddenly, really and truly, it just doesn't. It just isn't anymore. And moments like this, like Peter Mayer beating Viktor Orbán by a landslide in the election. It wasn't even close. Now that sort of moments is usually doesn't come out of nowhere. They actually build over time. They actually, they build like frustration. They start with frustration, with distrust, a sense that the system isn't working the way it should. And then eventually people begin to respond, like the Hungarian people apparently responded at the polls. And sometimes it's done quietly. And I thank God, in Hungary it was done quietly. We've seen countries where things get shaken up in ways that are rather undesirable. And sometimes, this actually completely disrupts the status quo. But while we're at this, in fact, while all this was going on, and even while I'm here talking to you about this, while influence, while transparency and power were all shifting, there was one question that actually matters the most that we were sort of like distracted from actually answering. And that brings me to the cost of living crisis that the whole world, not just one country, not just the US, not just Great Britain, not just Europe, but the whole world is facing: the cost of living and the real world impact of it. Because and some people will begin to ask, how does this affect me? Hey, look, it affects all of us. Because while these stories are actually playing out at the top, the average person is actually dealing, with something very, very real. Life is actually getting more and more expensive I was going to say as the days go by. I'm sorry, as the seconds go by. I have not seen in my how many decades of being alive and being conscious about what's going on around me. I haven't seen this sort of crisis in a very long time. Life is getting more expensive. I'm talking food. I'm talking, fuel. I'm talking basic living. It's just getting more. It's just costing more and more as the seconds go by. Sorry, pardon me. As seconds go by. And most people don't actually seem to connect the dots. But they're actually connected. Those dots are actually connected. Decisions are actually being made at the top, and whether it's policy, whether it's influence, whether it's power struggles, these things actually show up in our everyday life, and for me that's the part that often really gets overlooked, because it's easier to focus on headlines, those trending headlines and stuff, than it is to actually ask what those headlines actually mean for you. What do these headlines actually mean for us? But once you can actually start connecting it, for me, I actually think it becomes much harder to actually ignore. So, hey, ladies and gentlemen, when you do look back at April 2026, it's not just, for me, I think it's not just about individual stories. It's actually about a pattern, an emerging pattern, a pattern that worries me, and I think it should actually worry you. You have, one hand, you have incentive shaping behavior. On the other hand, you have transparency being questioned. Then you've got power shifting, and now you've got the consequences of being felt. The consequences that are being felt by everyday people like you and I. So the real question for me is: are you paying attention to what actually matters, or are we just reacting to what's actually put in front of us? Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.